Initiative and the UCI Water Initiative, I want to welcome you and warmly thank you for joining us this evening for our public affairs program entitled Crystal Clear, the Flint Water Crisis. My name is Douglas Haynes. I'm a professor of history and faculty director of the Medical Humanities Initiative. The Medical Humanities Initiative and Water Initiative are part of an ambitious campus-wide effort launched in 2012 to promote and accelerate interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary collaboration among faculty across our 13 academic and professional schools and programs. Driving these initiatives, which currently number 8, is a desire to advance fundamental and applied research and scholarly insights into the grand challenges of our day. The titles of the various initiatives capture both the breadth and scale of this campus endeavor. They include UCI Oceans, Salton Sea, Sustainability, Data Science, Exercise Medicine and Sports Science, and finally, Ending Family Violence. These initiatives are noteworthy not only for the subject matter that I just described, but also for our dedicated focus on engaging the wider community served by UC Irvine. Tonight's program is no exception. Bringing to bear faculty expertise on contemporary challenges represents one of the unique responsibilities of a public university, and UC Irvine takes that responsibility very seriously. The title, Crystal Clear, therefore, serves as a provocation to collectively examine the meaning of the crisis in Flint, Michigan. I am sure that many of you are familiar with the basic facts that have been widely reported in the national and local media. In April 2014, the city of Flint switched to a new water source, the Flint River. Residents began reporting discolored and foul-smelling water, as well as rashes and other ailments. In the meantime, whistleblowers drew attention to alarming levels of lead in the water supply and in the blood of children. But what does the crisis mean? Is it simply a product of human error, a reflection of a theory of the role of government in society? Are there short and longer causes? Could it be the result of the collapsing capacity of state and local governments in the wake of the Great Recession? Or was the city of Flint already hollowed out as a result of deindustrialization that began in the 1970s and led to the exodus or outsourcing of jobs abroad, as well as to right-to-work states? Or is it a manifestation of the silent but relentless effects of economic inequality, racial injustice? These are just some of the questions that I have, and I am sure that you will have others, and I imagine they will be far more insightful. Our panelists today, or this evening, will help us understand the Flint crisis, add to our knowledge base, and leave the conclusions to you. Each will frame Flint in terms of their expertise. At the conclusion of the 3 presentations, the floor will be open to questions. At this time, I want to introduce the speakers in ascending order. Andrew Highsmith, on your far left, is an assistant professor of history, a specialist in 20th century American urban history and other subfields. Andrew joined the department just last July, and his scholarship has already been felt locally and nationally. His very timely first book is entitled Demolition Means Progress: Flint, Michigan, and the Fate of the American Metropolis. Next is David Feldman, a professor and chair of the Department of Planning, Policy, and Design. He is the faculty director of UCI Water. Trained as an economist, he specializes in water resources management and policy, global climate change policy, ethics and environmental decisions, and adaptive management and sustainable development. Our first speaker is Adele Ogunsenta. He is a professor and chair of population health and disease prevention, program in public health. Adele specializes in environmental and human effects of industrial development with respect to the prevention and remediation of hazardous pollutants. Adele? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me see if I can get the apologize. We should have gotten this done earlier. Okay, well, do you have a thumb drive? Thank you. It has to be marked. It's Keynote.
I just got it. I have a lot on there.
Max. Okay.
Is that one?
That's good. That's good. No, I'll. Well, gosh, thank you so much. Technology always finds a way to scuttle things, but not tonight. We won't let it. Thank you, Doug, for that warm introduction to the program and to these excellent initiatives that are making UCI such an exciting place to work and to study, to do research, and to respond to contemporary issues in our country and in our world. So I'm really thrilled to be here today to share with you. I have just a few comments on the topic from a public health perspective. I thought I will be the third speaker, but it's good to go first. So given that we have a historian, planner, policy analyst on the panel, I thought I would begin with a short quiz. And this is a quotation. Anyone here in the audience can tell me who said this. The history of child-lead poisoning in the past century in this country is a good example of how powerful economic interests can prevent the implementation of a useful truth. I'll give you all a second or two to tell me who spoke these words. Could have been spoken yesterday or this month. It's Benjamin Franklin. And it just illustrates how little things have changed. He lived in the 1700s. His face is on a $100 bill. He did a lot of things, but one of the accomplishments that he had was his contributions to public health, which a lot of us do not know. He made that statement along with many others, and in a letter dated 31st July 1786, he wrote to a young admirer about the state of Massachusetts. They passed a legislation that prohibited, under severe penalties, the use of lead-containing hardware by distilleries because the lead poisoned people, causing them to have dry bellyache with loss of the use of their limbs. They were drinking rum. Today we would try to figure out whether it's the rum that's causing the dry bellyache or it's the water. But he was very smart, and he knew that they made rum in Massachusetts the way they made rum in Kentucky, and the difference was the hardware that they used. 200 years later, we face the same problem with leaded contamination of drinking resources. This time it's not rum, it's not for adults, it's drinking water. It's a convenience to turn the tap and to have water flowing, a convenience that we take for granted, that water is safe and beneficial and available whenever we want it. Today we have reason to believe that up to 12,000 children in Flint, Michigan, are poisoned by lead contamination based on something that we could have prevented if we took Benjamin Franklin's arguments and lessons to heart. Lead is not new. The scientific symbol for lead is Pb, which we get from the word plumbum, which you will recognize as the same root of plumbers. The Romans used lead to pipe drinking water to households, and there are scientists who believe that this led to the downfall of the Roman Empire, the lead poisoning that associated with the use of these lead pipes. Vitruvius wrote about this in 80 to 70 BC when he lived. So we know a lot about how to make it, what damages it can do. And the bottom panel is a picture of lead pipes taken from Flint, Michigan in the last 2 months or so. And you can see this bulbous section of it where a lead pipe was essentially soldered to a copper pipe. This was a shortcut because copper is a little bit more expensive than lead, and the law says to replace all of the lead pipings that are used in urban centers. But we cut corners sometimes, and we essentially glue the lead to the copper, hoping that nothing will reveal this shortcut in terms of health or monitoring that's required by law. I began my excursion into this topic many years ago. This was an article that we published in 2000, where we were thinking of creating a biosensor for similar situations where either we were not able to identify the pipe to replace it with safer alternatives, that we could create a sensor based on the enzyme that humans use to respond to lead poisoning, but that also bacteria that are present in drinking water will be able to tell us with the sensor what content of lead is in that water. And we were able to show with this method that, in fact, this enzyme responds to a lot smaller level of lead than the regulations that protect people in terms of EPA permissible levels of lead in water. So it was a recommendation that came out of this publication to say that we should probably lower the permissible levels of lead in water. We're still not at zero. That's the goal, but certain levels of lead are permitted in drinking water today. I also wrote a lot about the health effects of lead. In other contexts, lead we know, especially for children, IQ reduction, increased blood pressure, stomach problems, anemia, nephropathy, encephalopathy. And this is not all. There are established levels of lead that, based on scientific research, will trigger these health outcomes. But increasingly, we're filling in the data. We know that that enzyme I showed you in the last slide, different people have different versions of it. And so some people are much more sensitive to lower levels of lead than others. In this room, maybe about 20% of us are going to be extremely sensitive to lead, having more lead in their blood than somebody sitting next to you, even though we're in the same room facing similar exposures. So there are genetic reasons why some people are more sensitive, may reflect more serious health conditions, but in general, everybody who's exposed to high enough lead will experience some health consequences, in part because there's no use for lead whatsoever in the human body. It's foreign. It has no necessary physiological reasons to be there. So there's always some challenge to the human body. We also know that the children of Flint are not just exposed to lead in drinking water. This country, we have not been able to drive lead completely out of the body. Everybody in this room probably has a certain amount of lead in our blood. We may not get it from water, but there are many other products, from the paint in the wall to electronic gadgets, which I studied in the last 10 years or so, to cooking pigments, petrochemical refining. We get a little bit in our body all the time, and we get rid of them. However, we depend on regulatory policies to push the limits of manufacturing and pollution to the bare minimum so that each one of us is exposed to less and less amounts of lead, and hopefully the benefits to our health will improve. These policies have not worked very well, but they have worked. So this is 1997 to 2014. This data I just got from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, because many states are required to report the blood lead levels of children into a central database. Not all states do it, but many states do comply with this request. So we can figure out whether these policies to get rid of lead in paint, in automobile batteries, in electronics, in water pipes are working. So you could see this is the blue bars are the number of children tested, and on the on the right side is the bar of the percentage of children with high levels of lead beyond what was the standard at the time, 10 micrograms per deciliter. So we can see that about 4% of children nationally have excessive levels of lead in their system. Most of these children are on the East Coast. California doesn't report the data anymore to CDC, so that's why it's not there. But most of the high levels of lead in blood for children are where the older buildings, the older pipes, are still present and have not been replaced with the newer versions. And Flint, Michigan is, of course, part of this cluster of risky neighborhoods where children tend to be exposed. There are, as Doug was saying, some populations that we need to pay particular attention to. So in the years 2007 to 2010, that we've been monitoring blood lead levels in children, there are some disparities on ethnic categories. Mexican Americans, like a lot of health outcomes, actually do better than most other groups. But African Americans, as with other health outcomes, also do poorly, partly because they inhabit a lot of the older sections of town and older buildings where children tend to remain exposed for long periods of time. In this month's American Journal of Public Health, now famous article by Dr. Atisha, talks about these ethnic differences within Flint, and it raised the level of proportion of children with high levels of lead in their blood from 2.4 to 4.9%. So that becomes a problem for the families living in that region, and that's a little bit more than the national average that I showed you, about 4% of the children in the country having high levels of lead in their blood. So in Flint, Michigan, we know what has happened. It's an attempt to save money. It would have cost, returning back to Benjamin Franklin on the $100 bill, $100,000 to make remedial action to prevent what this crisis has brought onto our country. That $100,000 would have been used to add phosphates and things that prevent lead from leaching into the water, but the city officials apparently didn't want to spend that much money. And so now we're in the realm of spending millions of dollars. President Obama authorized an emergency declaration. We don't know exactly how much money that will flow. The governor of the state has earmarked $195 million to remediate. But these are temporary solutions. A few weeks ago, I was asked to draft a briefing memo, presumably for the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, who's been called to testify in Congress about what exactly happened. And in my draft memo, it probably never will see the light of day, but it was a good exercise for me to go through. The EPA has known for many years that we need to change the infrastructure for distributing water in the country. But it's expensive. It's going to cost $247.5 billion to change the pipings. We know that there are 10 million older pipes that may contain lead solder distributed all over the country. I know Mississippi is battling with a problem as we speak. But 30% of the population that drinks water in this country are not served by pipes that are protected by federal law. So they're either serving less than the number of people required to trigger federal regulation or state regulation in some cases. And so they continue to be vulnerable. My recommendation is that in this congressional testimony, we not just look at Flint, because Flint is just the latest of people vulnerable, sensitive to differences in the way we cut corners, either in manufacturing or try to save money from state budgets and city budgets that are always under pressure, that this calls now for federal action to do this once and for all. EPA can get this money if we have the will to convince Congress to allocate funding, not temporary solution, but permanent solution, to actually go around and change all of those pipes in every community in the United States, but to have more rounded policies around lead. It's been a long time since Franklin. We need to be able to move on. That's my take. Thank you.
All right. Is that yours right there?
It's me.
So let's tell this out.
Thank you.
You've got it there.
Laser pointer here.
Just hit this.
Excellent. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure to talk about this crisis and to hopefully spur more discussion about this issue tonight. Just one very brief correction. I'm trained as a political scientist, but that's okay. I'm recovering from that and have been for much of my career. As Deli pointed out, Flint is a public health crisis. It is also a crisis of deindustrialization, as we're going to learn, and it is ultimately a crisis of a policy failure. We think, in one of the most highly developed countries on the planet, that by the 21st century, we would have water supplies that would be assured in their safety and potability. And when a crisis like this erupts, we realize that's exactly what we do not have. This is from a quote by Calit Brown, who is a longtime Flint resident who stopped drinking her tap water several months ago. It is really a statement that summarizes the magnitude of this crisis. It is ridiculous that we have to live this way. What way? Depend upon a river when we had a water supply system from Detroit that did not have this problem, and as we're going to talk more about the problem of the distribution system, that we have to wear latex gloves when we wash dishes, and that we have to get our water from bottles. Let's go ahead and do this. So how did we get here? And I want to go through just a very quick timetable to this crisis, because one of the things that's really interesting about Flint is that it's a highly compressed crisis. It really erupted in a relatively short period of time and emerged with tremendous magnitude, almost out of nowhere. In April of 2014, the city of Flint canceled an agreement with Detroit's municipal water system. It had been supplied by water from Detroit for actually several decades, as you can see from this map. And what it did is it went into a regional cooperative agreement with several communities along Saginaw Bay to develop a distribution system that would link to Lake Huron. This pipeline was to be completed by 2016. The motive in making this switch was to save money, some $18 million over 8 years. As an interim measure, the city's emergency manager, and I'm going to have more to say about that in just a moment, was appointed by the governor, and in fact this was the fourth such individual to hold that role since 2011. The problem with Flint, and Doug alluded to it at the very beginning, was that this is a major American industrial city that had lost jobs, population, tax base, utility revenue bases. The city's emergency manager decided to restore fiscal solvency, and among many slips, decided to switch the supply to the Flint River. It took very, very little time before residents complained of discolored, foul-tasting, awful-smelling water. In February of 2015, the Environmental Protection Agency did test homes in Flint and found lead at 7 times the permissible level, the level regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act. And it asks the city of Flint, it inquires whether or not anti-corrosion measures, as Deli alluded to, have been taken. We'll come back to that issue momentarily, but the answer is they weren't taken, but the state of Michigan thought they were taken. So as a result, let down its guard. And again, as we're going to see, this is a cascading, almost perfect storm of policy failures. In the fall of 2015, there was a discovery that the Flint River itself, which was the temporary or interim source of supply, was 19 times more corrosive than Lake Huron, and it leached lead from, as we know, century-old or even older galvanized iron pipes. A little bit about the impacts and the reckoning of policy. And again, we need to be mindful that this is a rapidly developing public health and policy crisis, and it will continue to develop in ways that are very difficult for us to forecast. The Virginia Tech researcher Mark Edwards, who's actually been very widely quoted in this, was hired not by the state of Michigan, not by the EPA, but by the city of Flint, almost as a desperation because no one would really pay attention to the complaints of citizens, of residents of the city. He found that lead in the water supply was greater than the EPA threshold permitted under the Safe Drinking Water Act. And this was followed very quickly by a local pediatrician, Mona Hanna-Atisha, who found the elevated lead levels in the bloodstream of children. And this was almost incidental. This was through school health programs, testing routinely blood levels in kids. The city did not use phosphate compounds as anti-corrosion agent, but again, the state claimed it did and thought it did. The governor of Michigan formed a Flint Water Task Force, which in fact actually hired Mark Edwards as one of its members to give it more legitimacy. And here again, a solution, but not a solution. The task force blames the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality for taking a minimalist approach to regulation and oversight. That's true enough, but it's not true totally. It's not far enough really in its diagnosis. This is just a diagram, and actually I got this from the Detroit newspaper, and it's a very good illustration of basically how the lead got into the Flint River system and why the problem of the leaching lead from the corroding pipes occurred as such a major public health problem. How did all this happen? It seems like these are so easy things to have averted, and yet they weren't averted, and again, a cascading set of crises. Well, the roots of the crisis really do lie in what I would call the political economy of a declining city. When Flint suffered a period of deindustrialization, beginning with the contraction of the automobile industry in the 1970s and 80s, again, it lost jobs. It then subsequently lost population. It lost a tax base, and it lost a utility rate base. Now, while the city's population declined from some 200,000 back in the mid-1960s to fewer than 100,000 residents today, the cost of maintaining municipal water supplies did not decline proportionately. And there's some complex reasons for this that we don't always appreciate in our urban societies. The operation and maintenance costs of distribution and water treatment systems don't lessen from mere underuse. In fact, there's constant maintenance and upgrading that needs to be undertaken. There are capital costs that are incurred. Ironically, through the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, which raise standards on drinking water and other water quality issues, and this requires utilities to constantly spend in upgrading their systems. The effort to save money not only failed to consider the corrosion risk, but here's the real key, I think, or from a public policy approach. The emergency manager appointed by the governor was not really politically accountable to the residents of the city. He was an emergency manager appointed by the governor largely to restore fiscal solvency, but not really to respond to citizen complaints or even to make decisions about how to respond to citizen concerns. As a result, citizen complaints were largely unheeded. Local and state officials, in turn, tried to reassure residents that there were no serious health problems that they could detect, in effect to support and back up the emergency manager that was appointed and accountable to the state. And 40% of the residents of Flint live below the poverty line. They are chronically disempowered from decision making, and this was a recipe for an environmental justice problem, both in the process of making decisions and ultimately in the outcomes that faced the city and will continue to face it now. This is a figure that comes from a professor of economics, interestingly enough, from Michigan State University, down in East Lansing, not too far from Flint. And this is a diagnosis of the average increase in water system costs in the U.S. since the 1980s. The 100 represents basically the consumer price index. And basically the consumer price index has gradually increased through the mid part of our decade. Natural gas costs have increased, electricity costs have increased, local phone rates have increased. But look at water and sewer rates. They've really increased quite considerably and surprisingly to many people. A principal driver of these water costs are operation and maintenance costs of water utilities. We want our water systems to be reliable. We want them to be safe. We want to make sure that they're healthful. And the large costs of water systems are not the water, it's the operation of particularly water treatment systems. The monitoring and the treatment, particularly of contaminants of concern, and I want to come back to that issue at the very end, is very important in understanding the broader future context of this crisis. Federal budget cutbacks for treatment and supply puts the funding burden for making these improvements in recent years increasingly on states and cities. And cities like Flint, as we've made the case, can't really afford to do what needed to be done. And the state of Michigan really was not a high priority on their radar given their lack of resources as well. And so I think this helps to explain some of the conundrum facing Flint and possibly other cities as well. In public policy, we often speak of known unknowns, things we don't know, but we don't know them. So we just keep doing more research and investigation until we manage to resolve some of the mysteries. But there are also unknown unknowns. And I think the Flint crisis really exemplifies both of these problems, both of these challenges. Let's look quickly at the known unknowns. This crisis could have been averted if precautions were taken. This is a message that you've already heard this evening. It's a message you're going to continue to hear. Precautions were not taken, probably due to haste in making the transference, the belief that established treatment methods were adequate, and the peculiarities of regulation. There were warning signs. The water in Flint's system, as the city was depopulated, much of the water system was underutilized. And as a result, water spent time sitting idle in large parts of the distribution system. When fed suddenly with warmer Flint River water, that bred E. coli and other contaminant problems. The addition of chlorine to treat E. coli increased levels of trihalomethanes. And in fact, this was also found in the water supply of Flint. and these were in excess of federal standards. We do not know, but some believe that the addition of the chlorine may also have worsened the corrosion problems. So you've got a cascading set of public policy concerns that may, in fact, continue to face many other cities. Some officials, the director of the regional EPA office, lost their jobs, either by resignation or by being fired. But personnel changes alone don't resolve the problems. They simply seek to kind of ablate criticism. Some known unknowns. These are from the United States Environmental Protection Agency, where our drinking contaminants come from. And everything in green are regulated contaminants that are detected in our water supplies nationally. The red are unregulated contaminants. And a question that's often arises when we deal in these kinds of discussion are, why are some things that are contaminants not regulated? And we'll come back to that in a moment, but one of the reasons is because they're not really tested for harm, or their harm is yet unknown, or it's simply too expensive to undertake everything that would need to do to remove them from our water supply, and it's believed that they're at concentrations or levels within water not to be harmful. So, some unknown unknowns, bigger challenges. We know that thousands of children in Flint have ingested high levels of lead. We know that mental and physical health problems will arise, but they may be latent for years. This will impose extraordinary costs on families, even with proposed federal aid and legal remedies. Some of you may have seen in the LA Times this morning. There is the possibility that there may be lawsuits under the 14th Amendment, that children have been denied their civil rights by undue actions. All true, but these are high uncertainty issues. And lead in urban water, as we know, may be nationally widespread. Lead in plumbing has been outlawed as of 1986, but indoor components, until 2 years ago, could still contain up to 8% lead. So this is not a problem that's going to go away. This is a problem that's going to continue in a lot of places. As Deli pointed out, really does require a massive change out of plumbing. We've already seen in other parts of the United States, cities throughout the country, that have reported similar problems over the past decade and have, in some instances, taken expedient action to try to resolve these problems. Unlike most contaminants, lead enters drinking water after it leaves the water treatment plants. Federal and state regulations monitor lead and other contaminants at the facility outlets, not really in people's homes. Will policy reforms mandate changes in this? Are we now going to have to think about the way we measure and monitor contaminants, particularly like lead? That's an unknown. And then two things in purple, which I want to end in my discussion. Will Flint induce more Americans to rely on bottled water, a largely unregulated, expensive commodity, targeted in its marketing to underrepresented groups, and not a healthful source of public water supply? And will we ignore lesser known, but perhaps more significant concerns to potable water safety and security? Like what? Well, in conclusion, we would be remiss not to recognize some broader issues in our society that I think Flint simply reminds us we need to become more attuned to in terms of an overall holistic view of public health, of water supply safety, and of environmental justice. In the United States, minorities spend a greater proportion of their income, up to 1%, according to some studies, on bottled water, compared to less than 0.5% by whites. Yet the non-use of tap water and the use of bottled water as a primary water supply is not only costly, but it may result in adverse dental health because it's not fluoridated. It may subject people to tap water filtration schemes, and as these figures show, it is marketed to underrepresented groups. This, to me, is an environmental justice issue that is going to become bigger as a result, nationally, as a result of the Flint crisis, and we need to be very attuned to it. Public drinking water supplies are, in general, very safe and much safer and much better for you than bottled water. But crises like this will lead people to do the opposite. And contaminants of emerging concern. There are many labels for this, but they pose threats from very common products such as medications, nutraceuticals or vitamins, cosmetics, flame retardants, microbeads, which, as many of you know, are found in a number of soaps and shampoos. And although there are bans that are now being instituted, both by industry and by governments around the country and around the world, these endocrine disrupting compounds are hard to detect. They are difficult to remove. In many cases, they do not biodegrade easily or only over very long periods of time. And the solutions to managing these problems in our water supply largely rely on changes in consumer behavior, not, unfortunately, in public policy. So we'll leave it there. Thank you.
I'm the only one without slides. I feel left out of the party. Can everybody hear me all right? Yeah, okay, great. So hello everyone, and thank you so much for attending tonight's discussion. Thanks, of course, to my co-panelists and to Professor Doug Haynes for organizing this. Thanks also to Water UCI and the UCI Medical Humanities Initiative for sponsoring this event. I'm really happy to be here with you, of course, disappointed at the circumstances. As you heard, my name is Andrew Highsmith, and I'm an assistant professor of history here at UCI. I'm also the author of a recently published book on the history of racial and economic inequality in Flint, Michigan. The title of that book is Demolition Means Progress: Flint, Michigan, and the Fate of the American Metropolis. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with my research, and since I've only been here a little bit, I'm assuming that's most of you, Demolition Means Progress is a case study of race, class, and regional development in metropolitan Flint from the 1920s to the present. And at its core, it's a book about the political economy of racial and economic inequality in modern America. As such, one of its key aims is to explain Flint's transformation from a segregated General Motors factory town into the hyper-segregated post-industrial metropolis that's been in the news so much lately. Now, in doing the research for this book, I came across a great deal of evidence regarding environmental inequality and public health inequality in the city and region. For example, I learned about the ways in which racial segregation, industrial pollution, and substandard housing interacted to shape massive public health disparities between whites and blacks. I discovered how waste disposal programs and services negatively impacted African Americans and the poor. And I learned about how deindustrialization helped to strip the city of the jobs and resources necessary to sustain positive public health outcomes. In short, I found that Flint has a very long history of environmental and health inequality. Although the General Motors factories that once fouled the city's air and water are now long gone, the types of structural inequality and environmental injustice that I wrote about in this book are still major problems today. And so, as someone who's studied the history of Flint for quite some time now, the latest headlines about Flint's toxic water crisis have triggered a profound sense of déjà vu. Now, I know that many of you have been following the Flint water crisis carefully, and we've heard about some of it from our previous speakers. But for those of you less familiar with what's happened there, let me just provide a very brief summary, very brief chronology of what's happened so far, building on some of what my colleagues have already said. In November 2011, Michigan Governor Rick Snyder declared that the city of Flint was in a state of financial emergency. And after he made that declaration, he appointed the first in a series of emergency financial managers who have run the city government for much of the past several years. Their mandate was to cut costs and balance budgets. Now, between that time of that declaration and April 2015, when Snyder declared that Flint's financial emergency was resolved, the governor's appointees implemented a series of reforms that they claimed would return Flint to financial health. Chief among those was the decision to cancel Flint's decades-long standing water agreement with the city of Detroit in favor of joining a new regional water authority that had proposed to build a new pipeline to Lake Huron. Supporters of the new pipeline project argued that it would save the city of Flint about $18 million over the course of 8 years. The only problem was that it couldn't be built until 2016. So to meet the city's immediate water needs, city managers, not municipal officials, but city managers appointed by Governor Snyder, elected to use the Flint River as the temporary water source. And since the switch occurred in the spring of 2014, local citizens have complained of terrible water quality, awful smelling and tasting water, water that was making many people sick. And of course, one of the reasons for that is that the water is laced still with toxic levels of lead. According to medical experts, the lead exposures that have occurred are likely to have lifelong detrimental health effects on an as yet undetermined number of residents, particularly children. What's happened and is still happening in Flint is a human tragedy of epic proportions. What's more, though, it's happening in a city that has already suffered the cruelest of fates. A city that has been ravaged for decades now by the closure of manufacturing plants, by generations of racially biased urban development and housing policies, and decades of government austerity. The Flint that Governor Snyder vowed to reform in 2011 was already one of the most racially segregated, economically polarized, and politically fragmented regions in the United States. And now, after the emergency managers there effectively poisoned the water supply, the lives of nearly 100,000 Flint residents have been made immeasurably worse. Tragically, as is the case with so many environmental disasters, much of this was preventable. We now understand, for instance, as David was saying, that the simple failure to use proper anti-corrosive agents led to the leaching of lead into the water supply. And we also know that the slow responses of local, state, and federal officials to the crisis, as well as their penchant for obfuscation, only prolonged the lead exposure. All of this at this point is pretty clear. But I think there are also larger issues at play in thinking about the Flint water crisis that also warrant discussion. Beyond the criminal negligence of the many government officials who triggered this calamity, which must be addressed in the months to come, Flint's crisis is also the product of a variety of much larger forces, many of them structural in nature. And what I mean by that is that the city's water and infrastructure troubles also stem from generations of government-sponsored deindustrialization, so-called white flight, and disinvestment, forces that have eroded Flint's tax base and made it all but impossible to update or even maintain the city's crumbling infrastructure. To illustrate what I mean by this, let me talk for a few minutes here about some of Flint's recent history. Flint, a city which once claimed around 200,000 residents, a majority of them white, now contains fewer than 100,000, nearly half of them impoverished and over half African American. After decades of plant closures and layoffs, GM's workforce in the Flint metropolitan area, which once surpassed 80,000, now is less than 10,000. And the city's massive job losses have produced unemployment rates that routinely stretch into the low double digits, and in some communities of color, unemployment routinely hits nearly 50%. Among the many forces behind Flint's current economic and environmental crises, two key migrations stand out, both of them government-sponsored. Let me talk a little bit about these two key migrations. During World War II and the immediate post-war era, GM, like most American companies, took advantage of numerous local, state, and federal subsidies that encouraged the relocation of industry from cities to suburbs and rural areas. Over that same period, the home mortgage insurance programs implemented by the Federal Housing Administration and the Veterans Administration enabled millions of white Americans, including tens of thousands of Flint residents, to relocate from central cities to racially homogeneous suburbs. Because lenders and government officials largely excluded African Americans from participating in these programs and categorically refused to issue mortgages in many urban neighborhoods, federal housing policies contributed to increasing levels of racial segregation and class polarization. And the city's so-called slum clearance and public housing programs only intensified those economic, spatial, and racial divides. Together, the containment of African Americans in the city and the outward migration of businesses and white homeowners had dramatic effects in cities such as Flint. Among other things, they hardened the region's color lines and exacerbated black urban poverty while simultaneously deepening economic chasms between struggling majority black cities such as Flint and the predominantly white suburbs surrounding them. Over time, the outward migrations of jobs and white homeowners created deep economic distress in the city of Flint. And that distress is really nothing new. In fact, it started appearing as early as the 1950s and 60s, when city officials began confronting periodic budget shortfalls and infrastructure failures. Over the past generation, though, as Flint's urban crisis has gathered momentum, the quality of city services and the state of Flint's infrastructure have declined dramatically. On the ground, Flint's economic troubles translated into deep service cuts, layoffs for municipal workers, a host of new fees for basic services, deferred maintenance on the city's increasingly decrepit infrastructure, and of course, the state takeover that led to the current calamity. So this is all my way of saying that what's happened and is happening in Flint is in many ways a culmination of Flint's long-standing urban crisis, a crisis rooted in many ways in decades of deindustrialization, suburbanization, and policy-driven racial segregation. And so if Flint residents are to gain a measure of justice through all this suffering, I think we need to move ahead on several fronts in the months and years to come. First and foremost, the people immediately responsible for the crisis have to be brought to justice. And of course, there are state and federal investigations currently underway that may, in the end, deliver that justice. But that won't be enough. To repair the harm that's been done, the larger structural inequities that I've been talking about for the past few minutes will also need to be addressed. And that means new investment in jobs, new investment in education, better and fairer housing, and of course, an all-new safe water delivery infrastructure. But it also means new investment in local government, and of course, new investment in lifelong medical care for all of those who have suffered from the exposure. But Flint's crisis, I think, also points to the need for a new commitment among government officials to preserving and protecting the public interest, something that's been missing from fiscally obsessed urban governments for far too long. And so, to close, if we've learned anything from this disaster, it's that you can't cut your way out of urban crisis. We tried it, and look what happened. Thanks very much.
You've heard from my three colleagues, and now the floor is open for your questions and comments on the Flint water crisis. Don't be shy. Or ask the questions at the same time. Back there.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I don't believe that 40 have, I think there have been 40 cases of it. I think there have been around a dozen deaths from it. But that's, I think, somewhere around 4 times what it would be in a normal year. But absolutely, it's been, I think, many, and Dealey can speak to this, I think, more, but certainly a relationship between the E. coli and the stagnant water in the system and the spread of Legionnaire's disease. But you're right to point out that's been another of the effects of this.
Yeah, David mentioned 2 violations before anyone talked about lead. One was just using water that did not take so well to the normal disinfection process for drinking water, and that led to the coliforms, which are indicators, getting higher at levels than federal regulations. When there are coliforms present, there are probably other pathogens. And in this case, the Legionella species cause disease. Now, I always think that there are probably other low-grade diseases that we didn't know about, because coliforms are just an indicator that there are other things present. And we'll probably never know the full extent of susceptibility to pathogens. It was an attempt to remove those pathogens that led to addition of more chlorine than probably warranted, which led to chemical pollutants, the disinfection byproducts that David talked about. Those are associated with cancers, but again, we'll never know until many, many years from now if there were any consequences that are due to the exposures to these chemical disinfectant byproducts. That chlorine also probably promoted the leaching of lead, and that's when we found out that there is something wrong, because there was a monitoring program for lead. But these other low-level pathogenic diseases, probably many people suffered, maybe diarrhea, maybe they recovered, and we'll never know for sure. Yeah. Yeah, I let David talk about the urban structures and the populations that inhabit different parts of town, but this is a particularly difficult problem with older cities. I don't know if you remember in Los Angeles last year, we had this big flood at UCLA because the infrastructure was decaying. Nobody talked about lead at the time because we were all focused on X-side and lead poisoning of the neighborhoods in Los Angeles. But the infrastructure around older cities, we just have not thought long and hard about the life expectancy of many of these infrastructure, especially around water, to know when to replace them, and because of the population movements, that by itself makes certain people more at risk than others. So if people move into inner cities, we've known this for a long time around lead paint, which is another stalled policy that we made, saying we're going to eliminate lead in paint in all the buildings, but it's expensive. It puts other people at risk when you try to scrape away these paintings. And really, the data on children and the disparities across the ethnic groups just simply reflects who's living in those old buildings, in those places where the infrastructure is old. It may not have been on purpose that we designed it that way, but it's an intersection of the demographic changes and our lack of investment in modifying and improving the infrastructure. So it may not have been a deliberate, racism, but the consequence of not planning to support people who are poor and not able to move away from those infrastructures is the consequence that we see. So.
Yeah, I totally agree with Delhi, and just to amplify a response to your question, part of it was the global impacts of this problem. And one of the things that we're seeing in a lot of developing countries in particular is these problems have arisen in older cities in the developing world. And one of the strategies that is being pursued is the outsourcing, if you will, of water system management. Basically, the privatization revolution in many developing countries. And we know that, in fact, many of the privatization efforts are promising increases in efficiency, replacement of antiquated infrastructure, more efficient maintenance, better quality water, but also at extraordinary high costs, often exacerbating problems of injustice, particularly in developing countries, and essentially giving these outsourcing corporations that are taking advantage of the problem of managing infrastructure, particularly in developing countries, putting them in positions where they can often control and monopolize virtually every aspect of water. In Bolivia, for example, where this has occurred some years ago, part of the deal that was made in privatizing water utilities was that the water utilities that were privatized would also control water collected off of people's roofs. That was part of the supply that they would manage. This is not, a long-term solution to these kinds of problems, but the global implications are really clear in what you're saying. If we cannot invest public funds in improving and restoring infrastructure, pressures to outsource will advance, and that will be one of the consequences.
Going off on the point of post-industrialization era, I was reading recently that not only is Flint, Michigan a very stark example of what's happening in cities, but a lot of Native American tribes, particularly in the Southwest, have been afflicted by contaminated water for several years now. And this has to do a lot with the mines that have been completely abandoned now that nobody's using them in there. All the work just went away in a flash. Particularly even mines that are being used now. I know the Gold King mine is a very recent event that occurred, in which everyone saw the pictures online of like the river completely changing colors overnight. Do you know what the cost would be for some of these abandoned mines to be hushed up so that they stop contaminating the water supplies of even Native American tribes? Because again, going off the theme, it always seems that these minorities are the ones that tend to be like, okay, we'll take care of it eventually, but that keeps getting stalled. Because one of the major factors that I read about was that uranium levels in water supply were several times higher than what's allowed to be healthy. So do you know kind of what the cost maybe would be of
Yeah, so let me see if I can capture the question. The populations that tend to live around old mines, especially Native Americans, suffer the consequences, and what will be the cost of remediating those mines? Mining companies are another example. We all benefit from mining operations, but the true cost to the planet, if you will, of getting these minerals out is never truly appreciated because we don't count the cost of the damage to the environment or to people. And so when you buy your copper pot or your gold chain, you pay a small fraction of the true cost. And so the legacy of abandoned mines, not just in this country, in South America, in Australia, parts of Africa, are just beginning to be realized. Now, there is another group of researchers interested in remediation. So replanting trees and shrubs and vegetation to sequester some of the toxic metals, including the radioactive ones. But when I was in graduate school many years ago, bioremediation was all the rage. We were doing genetic engineering on bacteria and plants to help remove many of these metals. DOE invested tremendously in this technology. But I can't tell you now where it's been successful. Partly we think of bioremediation as a cheap way to clean up polluted environments, but it's not easy to recapture what was there. And we probably will never be able to afford, given the state of the economy, clean up completely those places. Now there are pockets of successes. A lot of engineers work in this field as well. But if your question is, can we invest that much money that will take to clean up these sites only to leave the Native Americans and the poor people in those places? We probably won't do it. Not because it's not the best thing to do, but because of the economic considerations. And it's the same reason that the people who are left behind are those who are not able to move away from those risk factors.
Just to tackle that question from a different perspective, I can appreciate what you're saying about the lack of attention shown toward environmental catastrophes on native lands. And I think, oddly enough, that in some ways the Flint crisis is instructive in this way, because this has been unfolding now. If you think about the chronology, this has been unfolding for 2 years, this lead and water crisis, with very little public scrutiny until the past few months. And so it was very interesting to me. I've done all this research on Flint. I went there in the fall and did a book tour and spent almost all the time talking about water, really nothing else. And yet nobody outside of Michigan seemed to be really talking about it. And then all of a sudden, shortly after the new year, the newly elected mayor broke with the Snyder administration, declared her own state of emergency for the city. And right around the same time, local activists in the city began connecting their 2 years long campaign for clean water to the broader Black Lives Matter movement. And when those two things started to happen, the entire amount of attention on the city changed dramatically and very quickly. And so maybe there are some lessons in Flint about how to draw attention to some of these broader environmental catastrophes.
And just a quick response to the legal aspects of what you raise. Back in the 1970s, Congress passed something called the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, better known as Superfund, which was designed to provide a self-sustaining fund, not for mining, but for hazardous waste disposal, and basically work on the kind of same principle to figure out ways, including bioremediation and other technological approaches, to clean up contaminants largely that threaten groundwater and surface water supplies. One of the lessons of that process and what we've learned that's relevant to tribal nations, I think, are two things. One is that just as the contamination process is itself very contentious and controversial for obvious reasons, the introduction of various remediation approaches also is controversial. And choosing between them and involving publics in the selection of these processes is full of contention and dispute. And secondly, the problem of the sources of the water. Many tribal nations, as you know, are in effect, or at least various villages and communities, are in effect self-supplied. That is to say, they may be getting their water from a local well that is connected to something. We don't really know what. It's very hard to attribute or link or figure out the path of contamination and responsibility. This just compounds and confounds the solution.
Why don't you think they check the water before they, like the Flint water, why don't you think you checked it before they gave it to the people? The hot water. What did you do?
You don't mean, so the question is, why don't the authorities check the water before releasing it to the people? So all public water agencies have to do monitoring of the water supply. And if a regulated contaminant exceeds limits, they have to warn people, usually after the fact, that the water you've been drinking for the past month or so contain excessive levels of a particular pollutant. I think David and I talked about this particular situation where when you release water, you're not really thinking through what will get into the water supply because it leached from the pipes. Okay. So the water that was released may have been okay, but by the time it got to the tap on everyone's homes, it's no longer okay. There were news reports back to April 2014 that I saw that said, oh, the water is safe, even though people at home were complaining about the color and the odor, but from the perspective of even later than that.
Yeah.
So it's not being conscientious enough to go to the homes and what exactly are you worried about? Let's test it in your home. So there's a difference between what leaves the water factory and what the people are actually consuming.
Right, that's absolutely true. But even when there were signs that lead was in the water, and that was happening as early as January of 2015 at the University of Michigan Flint campus, they found traces of lead in the water there. They were slow to respond to that. And even once they started testing the water out of taps, they were using protocols that aren't normally used to test for lead. And so they were flushing the pipes for longer than you ordinarily would in a lead test, which helped to reduce the numbers. And then in one case, they actually fudged the numbers on a lead test because it came back too high. And so they manipulated the numbers so that the overall aggregate would be low enough to pass and meet the federal standard. And I think from the get-go, the line from emergency managers in the city and the Snyder administration was, we've already made this switch. The water coming out of the system at the water plant is good, and it's within federally acceptable levels, even if they're too high for anybody to tolerate. But they had already made this decision. They had made this decision to go with saving $18 million, and they weren't going to be dissuaded by it. But they did have evidence for quite some time that the water had significantly high lead levels. In some instances, I think Mark Edwards found that the water coming out of a few taps in the city was really the chemical equivalent of toxic sludge. And so it would be unfair to conclude that they just didn't know. They didn't have the information. They had information.
And just a very quick footnote to that, Mark Edwards himself has been quite critical of the fact that other investigators were not more proactive in reporting widely what they had found, but were almost too cozy with regulators and with government officials, and should have really gone really kind of the public intellectual route and said, this is horrible, this has got to be stopped, this has got to be averted.
So first I want to say thank you to the panel. I'm a third generation Flint resident. My family's still in Flint, and being so far from home, I find this to be incredible to see here the expertise here. I really appreciated the unknown unknowns because this is what's coming down and a lot of questions being asked amongst my family and community. And I just wanted to point out, I think, two known knowns that I think that the things that are really worrisome. The first was dealing with the controversial law. When the controversial law came into place, emergency managers, over 50% of the black population in Michigan were being governed by non-elected officials.
Right.
I think that's incredible just to think about the justice aspect of this. But I think more importantly, even the elected Mayor Walling in Flint, when on the day that the water switched, he gave a christening where he said that people were wasting their precious money buying bottled water. And I find this to be incredible because for people in Flint, while there was an emergency manager, there still felt like there was some accountability. And so I think one of the takeaways is that while the law is horrible, and even Mayor Walling has said that he fundamentally trusted that it would be done right, I think that there's a lesson, a known there to be had. And the second was dealing with the samples. We know that 2 samples were thrown out by the Department of Environmental Quality, and this fudged the data such that they didn't have to report to the Flint residents a year later. And I hope, especially as I'm a trained scientist and at the law school, that we can learn and hopefully create better connections between our policy scientists and, our lawyers and our scientists to make sure that proper protocols are followed. So to me, those 2 known knowns definitely need to be had in addition to your unknown unknowns that I felt incredible.
Great points. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much your presentation. Was very informative. I'm actually from Michigan as well, so it's home for me. My question is for Dr. Ogunsegun. You talked about there being sort of genetic risk factors for people being more susceptible to lead being affected by it. So I was wondering if you could touch on what some of those genetic risk factors are, and if there's an sort of, I guess, maybe an ethnic basis to that. 'Cause I'm thinking, there might be some synergy if certain ethnic populations are more susceptible to being affected by lead, and they're the ones being exposed to that lead, right? So I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Yeah, so the question is the basis for genetic susceptibility to increased lead poison effects. So I showed a 3-dimensional structure of a protein molecule called the aminolevulinate dehydratase, for short ALAD. There are 2 kinds of genes that encode for that protein. The enzyme is very sensitive to lead because it needs zinc in humans to work well. When we're exposed to lead kicks out the zinc because it's a tough metal, I guess. And so the enzyme doesn't work well. It's the second enzyme in the synthesis pathway for hemoglobin that we all carry. So there are people who have a version we call it 2. Most people will have 1. And there are people who have a hybrid, 1-2. And so if in the Caucasian population where we first found this out, 20% of the Caucasian population have the 2, what we call the 2 allele. So they will have either 2-2 or 1-2. We didn't find this in the African population in West Africa. In Brazil, where the population has mixed, you could actually trace the lineage of people based on the proportion of these alleles in the population. So you could tell how mixed Caucasian African Americans or Africans they have. So in the United, we don't know the origin of this polymorphism. We think that it actually served a protective purpose for people to retain lead in their blood so that it doesn't contribute to the other effects of lead, the more dangerous effects, which affects the IQ and other cognitive functions. So in the Flint population, for example, because African Americans have, it's actually a very mixed, if you go down to the genetic level, even though everybody looks African, there is a lot of mixture going on. So one would have to look into that population to see what children will carry the second allele, that they may be more prone to the kinds of health effects associated with that polymorphism. But right now we just assume that everybody who has more than 5 micrograms per deciliter of lead in their blood will be counted as having elevated blood lead levels. But down the road, it's hard to tell if all of those will have the same kinds of health effects. And it's important to not just base our protection of these children on their blood lead level, but also to do the genetic profiling to know who's going to need more help.
We have time for 2 or 3 more questions.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about your assessment of the scope of what's to come. Beyond the billions of dollars of infrastructure replacement, are there academic or government studies to trace the outcomes, particularly on children? Can we expect policy outcomes for more regulation and testing of water supplies in Flint and elsewhere? Are there lawsuits already in the pipeline? That sort of thing.
There are a number of class action lawsuits already in the pipeline, and I'm sure more to come. A fantastic op-ed in today's Los Angeles Times by a Stanford law professor suggesting that despite all of the evidence that's been amassed already of the extraordinary malfeasance of the emergency managers and the Snyder administration, that these suits actually have very little chance of succeeding, surprisingly. But those are in the pipeline. I think that as for the other issues, maybe I'll defer to my colleagues, but absolutely on that level.
There's been much discussion about various, in fact, there have been various proposals before Congress about funding, and has been mentioned what sources of revenues will support these funding proposals and what the funding will actually go toward, and whether it will be a kind of a one-shot funding or a long-term infrastructure replacement program, not to mention studies of the health impacts longer term. Again, we don't really know, but I think we can safely assume that there will be kind of 3 things happening almost simultaneously. One, there will be a series of investigations at all levels of government. Congress is yet to weigh in. There will be some sort of an investigation, probably targeting EPA and the Safe Drinking Water Act and its, presumed inadequacies in this case, and the failure of regulatory protocols to detect these things earlier and to act on them. So that's one. Secondly, there's going to be huge debates over compensation, and there need to be. How will people in Flint be compensated for the damage that's already been done? And who will pay for that? So that's a second. And then third, I think there's going to be a lot of demands, probably mostly on local levels, because right now the federal government does not seem to be really capable of acting in a unified manner on this issue, but lots of local activities about infrastructure and water awareness. A good thing that may come out of that is we will stop taking for granted the most valuable and precious commodity on the planet. That's the only good thing that will come out of it.
So we have a lot of laws that are not effective. The lead and copper rule was debated and passed and retracted. When we know we have a difficult, political system, Congress has to agree on many things. The Toxic Substances Control Act is old. Every attempt to change it get more green in terms of safety and away from toxic chemicals. California leads in some of this, but we're no less complicated, and it's very difficult to have policies that capture everybody. I got a question about my briefing memo, which is who will pay for this 240 million or billion dollars to change the infrastructure. And the knee-jerk reaction, oh, we can take it from defense. But I actually did say that we need a super fund for public health, in the sense that when I read about Exide Corporation and the penalty of $50 million to dig up soil in Los Angeles after decades of negligence and pollution, well, it's getting away with murder, essentially. And not to attack corporations, but we need a rainy day fund. We can do better than what we did with Superfund to clean up hazardous waste sites. But when people are actually already now affected, we're not talking about something that may happen, something that's already happened. We need a way to be able to reach out to fund source that's there to compensate, to clean up immediately. I think this is a challenge for Congress, and this is why the administrator of EPA needs to be bold. Where eventually, when she goes in front of Congress, yes, she can be defensive about who didn't do their jobs, but really we need to move forward and think about the next crisis and how to be able to have funds to deal with it right away. And of course, prevention is always better than cure. You have to dig up all those pipes and replace them.
On that note, I want to thank you all for joining us. Here at UCI, I especially want to extend a warm thanks to our panelists, and you can join me. I want to ask you before I close to do a few things. The first, if you have questions, please come down and speak with our panelists. Second, take advantage of the rich offering of all of the UCI excellence initiatives, including water and medical humanities and others. And finally, this is an election year. And most of you seem like this is your first election to vote in. That's a compliment. Get engaged. Learn. Knowledge not only means power, but it also means responsibility. Thank you for coming.